Good morning and welcome to the 70th Learn with Lorna. I hope you can see me okay. I've had some technical issues this morning, so that's why I'm only broadcasting on one channel as opposed to the 4 that I would usually do. So I really hope you can see me and everything is working okay. For those of you who are watching for the first time, my name is Lorna Steele. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. The Highland Archive Service has 4 archive centres across the Highlands of Scotland. One in Inverness, the Highland Archive and Registration Centre, Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, Skye and Lochaber Archive Centre in Portree, and Nucleus the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick. Thank you, Fiona, Mike, saying that it's all coming through okay. That's marvellous. If you're new to the series and you're watching for the first time, then all the previous episodes can be seen on the High Life Highland YouTube channel. So I've mentioned this is the 70th, so there's 69 others you can go back and have a look at if you would like to. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in the Learn with Lorna films, but if you're able to donate towards our work, then we very much appreciate that, and you can do that via our website. I wanted to start by saying thank you to all the people who've been in touch after last week's talk on football collections. It was particularly lovely to get some messages of people giving us some collections, additional collections of football, and that's really appreciated. So on a similar note this week, if you've got anything you think would be of interest to be kept, then please do contact us. We're carrying on today with this month's theme of sport and leisure. We're well into the Olympics, as you will all be well aware, I'm sure. So delighted for the athletes that they're able to compete, and if you've been able to tear yourself away from it to watch live, then I appreciate that. But this week we're looking at a sport that is not yet featuring in the Olympics, and that's the sport of Shinty. We hold a wide range of Shinty collections across our archive centres. We hold minutes and programmes, score notebooks, photographs, commemorative booklets, and a variety of other things. I'm particularly grateful to Hugh Dan McLennan for these and for the collections, and also for his support of events and promotion of events related to the history of Shinty. He will be a name known to many of you, I'm sure, if you're familiar with the game. And I wanted to start on that note with an overview of the game, and I'm very, very conscious whenever I do these that my audience is bound to be split between people who know a huge amount about that week's subject and people who might never have heard of it. And so that's something I'm always conscious of. So if you do know a huge amount about Shinty, please bear with me and add your comments and thoughts in. But I'm aware that for those out with the Highlands, they may not know much about the sport. So Shinty, or Camanachd, is a team sport. Each team has 12 players, including a goalkeeper. Each player carries a curved stick, sort of similar to a hockey stick, but not the same. It's slanted at both sides, and there's some other differences as well, called a caman. The aim is to shoot a small ball, it's a small leather ball, cork ball surrounded by leather, into the opposing team's goal. It's often likened to hockey as a kind of easy visual comparison, but there's quite a lot of differences between the sports. For example, in Shinty, the ball can be hit in the air, sticks can be lifted above shoulder height, there's a variety of other things. Shinty's long had a reputation for being quite a brutal game with a lot of injuries, and it's true that it is a very physically demanding game. But the modern, and there are accidents, certainly, but the modern game have done a lot to tackle that, if you excuse the pun. They've done a lot to tackle that, such as introducing mandatory head protection for juniors, and a lot of the seniors wear it as well. Shin guards, for example, because shin guards used to be a very common injury. Broken shins used to be a very common injury in Shinty. So all sorts of things. Shinty is played right across the world, mainly in places where Highlanders have made their mark, so the obvious examples being Canada, New Zealand and so on, but it's widely played across the Highlands, including at school. But where did the game come from? How did it develop, and why is it so much a part of Highland life? And that's a key point. I'm only going to touch on the Highlands here as I'm talking. Shinty is played right across the country, and so if you're watching from one of the Glasgow teams or somewhere else, then do feed into the comments, but I'm going to be focusing on the Highland teams. So again, much like football, games involving a stick and a ball have existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. In Roger Hutchinson's book Camanachd, which is a fantastic book of all sorts of information about the game. It shows an extraordinary carving from the 5th century BC in Athens that shows what looks exactly like a shinty match, other than everybody is naked, which in my experience is not the common shinty standard. But it just goes to show that much like kicking a ball around, that using a stick to hit a ball is something that we have always done. And there's early examples of newspapers from Caithness that show a variety of the game Knotty, Knotty, being played for hundreds of years and is still played. So there are varieties on this as well. But it's generally accepted that the Scottish sport of shinty and the Irish game of hurling share the similar roots, and they're been played for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. And one of the documents in our collections is a booklet that marks a centenary, an anniversary of Strathglass Shinty Club, and that gives us a summary of the sport, so I'm going to start by reading that one. Shinty is a sport which has given endless enjoyment to countless numbers of Highlanders, both in the participation and spectator aspects of the game down through the ages. The word shinty is derived from the Gaelic word shinty, meaning a bound or a skip, and thus suggests the drive to the ball by the club. According to Mr. Alexander MacDonald from Loch Ness Side, who wrote a paper entitled Shinty, Historical and Traditional for the Gaelic Society of Inverness, dated 18th December 1919, shinty is one of the oldest games in the world. It's nearly as old as the Gaelic language itself. Wherever in antiquity we find that language, there too we have shinty with it. Shinty came over from Ireland along with the early Scots in the 5th century. At the dawn of history proper, with Columba at Iona and King Brewd at Inverness, we have historic evidence that the game was played, and played too in much the same way that it is played today. We may also claim two well-known offshoots of the game. One is hockey, named as Camanach itself is, from the hooked stick or caman with which it is played. The Scottish game of golf, so much in fashion now, is from a side form of shinty, where the getting of the ball into a series of holes was the leading feature. The playing of this last game can be traced back both in Ireland and Scotland. Camanach is therefore a game of high antiquity. If you remember, last week we spoke about people being discouraged from playing football because it had no military advantage. Well, shinty was the opposite. Shinty was actively encouraged as part of the training for warriors or fighters. But it did share with football the reputational problem of being traditionally played on a Sunday, which of course was displeasing to many, as this extract from the Roskeen statistical account of 1845 shows. So this is written by the minister of Roskeen parish. And it's under the section Habits and Customs of the People. The people seem to be very little addicted to games or amusements of any kind. Formerly there used to be a great turnout on New Year's Day, old style, for the playing at shinty, but the practice has now almost totally died away. Connected with this great Highland game, we may relate the following traditional story. Rather more than a century ago, it was the practice of the people to meet at our dross in the heights of the parish on Sunday to play at shinty. When Mr. Bethune was settled as minister of the parish in 1717, this practice was one of the first things which caught his attention and which he determined to put a stop to. The way he managed to do so was this. There was a certain man noted for his activity and strength who was the chief and leader of the shinty players. Mr. Bethune sent for this man and promised to make him an elder. The man was at first naturally not a little surprised at this proposition, but after some persuasion consented to it. Upon his being shortly afterwards duly called to be an elder, Mr. Bethune informed him of various duties connected with his new office, and that he was especially bound to put a stop to the shinty playing on the Sabbath. The man promised to do so, and accordingly on the next Sabbath he repaired to the playing ground armed with a stout cudgel. He then declared to those assembled for their usual sport that if one of them dared to lift a shinty stick, he should forthwith feel the weight of the cudgel. The players, it is said thereupon, quietly retired, and never afterwards met again on the Lord's Day for a like purpose. So you get the feeling there of the displeasure of the church at sports being played on the Sunday. Among the items we hold at Hark at the Highland Archive Centre, we hold the Handbook of Schools Camanach Association, published in 1939 and called The Game of Shinty. The foreword of that was written by Donald Catanach of Kingussie, and it opens with this description. Of all sports, Camanach or Shinty is preeminently the game of the Highlander, in whose glens and straths it has been played from time immemorial. This essentially manly pastime calls for qualities of skill and good judgment to a greater degree perhaps than any other form of sport, so that those who take part in it must be fit physically and alert of mind. He goes on to describe the skills that are required from a Shinty player. The game of Shinty produces versatility in athletics. It will automatically train all parts of the body to work in harmony. By learning to hit with both sides of the Shinty club, the body will be developed symmetrically. The small ball trains the eye to be quick and keen. The speed of the game demands quick reaction and cool nerves. Tackling calls for sound judgment and skillful handling of the club. In using the club in a legitimate manner, the player must exercise self-control. Pitted against a single opponent, he must use his initiative to overcome him, and yet when playing for a team, he must sink all thoughts of self and play for the success of the team. Our Highland game has no place for selfishness. It calls for the highest form of team spirit, and for that reason I recommend this book, which contains so much useful advice for those playing the game. That talk about the importance of the game to the Highlanders, the importance of the entertainment value of it as well, is echoed in a little extract from Margaret MacDougall. You might remember I did a Learn with Lorna about Margaret MacDougall back at the end of last year, I think. It's all merging into all the knowledge. But she talks about the importance of Shinty as a spectator sport, and she says that entertainment in Inverness she's talking about, she says, add into that a Shinty match, and if you've never seen a match of Shinty, you have yet to experience the game which calls for the greatest stamina, fleetness of foot, coordination of muscle and eye that is amazing to the spectator and thrilling to watch. So for many years of its history, Shinty was played informally, but in very similar timing to the football things we talked about last week, football, rugby, various other sports, the formalising of the game came in mid to late 19th century. Among the earliest formed clubs, there was a number of different clubs across the country, several in Aberdeenshire, others outside the Highlands, particularly again in areas with a big expat community of Highlanders, so Glasgow, London, things like that. But the bulk of the clubs, and most of those in the Highland communities, come in the 1870s onwards. There are traditionally lots of games played on what you might call event days, celebration days, so particularly New Year's Day has always been a big day in the Shinty calendar, and for most of its history, Shinty has been a winter game. Strathglass, which is the Strathglass Shinty Club, who are based in Canach, that was one of the first of those 1870s clubs. Formed officially in 1879, but with plenty of evidence that matches had been played for long before that. And according to the commemorative booklet that I touched on a minute ago, the first reference to a Shinty club in Strathglass is from 1826, when apparently upwards of 150 Chisholms and other natives of Strathglass turned out to play a match split between the Braes and the Strath. The official forming of the club in 1879 was accompanied by the creation drafting of rules for consideration at a meeting in January 1880. And those are believed, when they were confirmed, to be the first constitution and written constitution and rules of a Highland Shinty club. The description of the first meeting was recorded in the Inverness Courier, and it appears as well in our collections. And it reads like this. The inaugural meeting was held at Canach Hotel on Tuesday the 10th of February 1880. It was arranged to march in procession from Canach Bridge to the field of play. The company was addressed by Captain Chisholm from his carriage, an important name, Captain Chisholm. He expressed pleasure at seeing so many present, and went on to express his hope that the club in its infancy would grow in strength and lead to the improvement, recreation and enjoyment of the people of Strathglass and surrounding districts. Reference was made by him to the antiquity of the game, a noble one and a favourite among the people. After referring to the qualities of body and mind required in a good player, and stating that the club intended to play on scientific principles, Captain Chisholm told how he had played the game with cousins and relations of the Strathglass people in Canada on ice, wearing skates. So a huge contributing factor in what went on to become ice hockey. He then drove to the head of the procession and blew up a tune on the pipes. The procession following carried about 20 flags and banners. On arriving at Comer, the field being placed at the club's disposal by Mr. Robertson, the pitch was marked out, about 300 yards by 200 yards, the goalposts being 12 feet apart. Sides were then chosen and 80 men doffed their coats and took up position under the direction of the captains, Mr. Chisholm, Kraske and Mr. MacDonald Cruve. Mr. Robertson at Comar, the umpire, threw up the ball between the captains and play commenced. The sides were well matched, each scoring a few points but no goal. After about an hour, refreshments were provided and other sports commenced, also with dancing by pipe music by John Campbell acting as piper to the club. This was followed by the first general meeting in the Glenafric Hotel, where the constitution and rules were confirmed. So that was the first, believed to be the first draft of rules for a club. The rules of the wider game were then formally established, following a famous game between Strathglass and Glenurquhart in 1887, which Glenurquhart won 2-0. And those two teams continue every year to have a rivalry. Shinty has always been a very, very community-driven sport, long-standing local rivalries between teams, and you can see that that's been the case right from the very beginning, and it continues to be a real feature of the game. So we've seen it in Glenurquhart and Strathglass. Who else has that kind of rivalry? Well, another example is are the teams of Lovat and Bewley. Lovat, which is based in Kiltarlity and named for Lord Lovat, was founded in 1888, with Bewley being founded 4 years later in 1892. Again, informally, the teams had played each other for decades before that, but those are the official founding dates. The two teams are situated in communities that are 4 miles apart, so they're even closer than Glenurquhart and Strathglass. In addition to all the other fixtures that they take part in, since 1904, Lovat and Bewley have faced each other on New Year's Day in the Lovat Cup. It's an annual game that draws a large crowd. It has it's the second most attended fixture in the Shinty calendar, and we hold documents relating to both of those teams. I've touched there on the Lovat Cup. Now, there are numerous cups to be won in Shinty, and I won't have time to talk about them all. And for much of its history, the sport's big events have all been tied to cups and challenges rather than a national league, although that has changed in recent years, and I'll come back to that towards the end. But perhaps the two teams most strongly associated with Shinty, two Highland teams, there are other teams like Kyle's Athletic and various others who have been very successful, but from a Highland perspective, the teams probably most associated with the game are Newtonmore and Kingussie, both founded in 1890. Now, the Newtonmore and Kingussie rivalry, unlike the Lovat and Bewley one, is not based on one particular cup that they compete for all the time, but rather is based on a long history of dominating the major fixtures and the fact that they are only 3 miles apart. And we'll touch more on this as we go on. But you can see there with the founding of these clubs coming in that by the 1890s, when those two major teams were established, there were dozens of officially founded clubs. But they were often, again, much like the football, they were often using different variations of rules, and they didn't have an overarching governing body. There was a league being played and a competition being played in the Glasgow area between the southern teams, but there was a need by this point for a wider structure, a national structure. And so the next key date when the story of history is 1893, the creation of the Camanachd Association. Camanachd Association was founded in Kingussie in the Victoria Hall in October 1893. Its aim was to develop Shinty, to standardise the rules and to establish a system for national competition. And we hold copies of the minutes of the Camanachd Association from 1893 through to the 1960s. There were representatives of a huge number of clubs present at that first meeting, so I wanted to read them to you just to show the geographical spread, as well as the geographical spread and the number of teams that were in existence at this point, and keen for this to go ahead. So at that first Camanachd meeting were Aberdeen University, Alvie, Bray Lochaber, Glenurquhart, Granton, Inch, Invergarry, Inverness, Kingussie, Lagan, London Northern Counties, Newtonmore, Strathglass, Strathpeffer and Kinlochhew. And they also had letters of favour in from Glasgow Cowell, Inverary, Ballachulish, Edinburgh University, Edinburgh Northern Counties, Edinburgh Camanachd Club, Fort William, Speonbridge, Furness, Oban and Strachan. So a huge geographical spread, and what I found surprising about that was the distance some of those people will have travelled to attend that meeting, so clearly seen as a really big step forward in the development of the game by those teams at the time. I mean, we know retrospectively it was a huge turning point, but they obviously knew that at the time too. They decided at that initial meeting that the annual subscription would be 10 shillings, and they agreed the official rules of the game at that meeting after a 5-hour debate about the rules. There was a decision taken then to use the new association to create a National Cup challenge, and that was how the Camanachd Cup came into being in 1896, 3 years after the formation of the association. The first cup was won by Kingussie. The Camanachd Cup final was and continues to be the premier event in the Shinty calendar. I am sure that people watching here will have attended a Camanachd Cup final. Thousands of spectators and broadcast on national TV, and that's why I'm saying that many of you will be familiar with the name Hugh Dan McLennan. Originally, the competition was designed in such a way that it would always result in a North team contesting the Cup with a South team, but that isn't the case any longer. The Cup itself was made in the year that the Camanachd Cup was first played, so 1896. It's a large silver cup with a Shinty player on the top of it, and the figure was modelled on Jock Dallas. The figure on the top was modelled on Jock Dallas, who was a renowned Kingussie player in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And if you're interested in seeing what he looks like, if you go onto our website, Ambala, there is a picture of Jock Dallas there with his family. And the Dallas family, of course, many of you will know, are still heavily involved in the game. Jock's great-grandson, Ali Dallas, currently holds the record for the most Camanachd Cup final wins, 15 to date. The rivalry that I mentioned between Kingussie and Newtonmore and their dominance in the sport is clearly visible in the Camanachd Cup results. Newtonmore have won 34 times, Kingussie have won 23, making 57 wins between the two teams. All other teams combined have won 55 times, so you can see that dominance there. And the importance of the Cup can be seen in records out with the Shinty collections, which I find really interesting. It's not just in the Shinty collections that you can see the importance and the dominance of the sport, it also appears elsewhere. So for instance, this is a turn of the century extract from the Lagan Police Daily Occurrence book. He says, it's 29th of December, and he says that at 10 AM I was engaged in writing at the station, and then he goes on to say, I proceeded to attend a Shinty competition for the Camanachd Trophy between Lagan and Kingussie Shinty teams. The Kingussie team were the winners, having scored 1 goal, with Lagan scoring 0. Just really interesting that it is important enough and relevant enough to feature within those Police Daily Occurrence books. 2 years after the establishment of the Camanachd Cup came the McTavish Cup, a Rose Bowl trophy. And again, as I've said, I'm not going to be able to talk about all the cups, but I wanted to touch on this one for a reason, which I'll come back to. The McTavish Cup is named after Duncan McTavish, who is a Stratheric man, and it was first won by the Skye Camanachd. Although various teams have won the trophy, there is again a very clear pattern of dominance between Kingussie and Newtonmore within the records of the winners of this game, of this Challenge Cup. We hold the McTavish Camanachd Association records from 1904 through to 1961, and that's why I particularly wanted to mention it, because I'm going to read an extract from those minutes shortly, which I find incredibly powerful, and I hope you will also. Coming into the turn of the 20th century, things are going well for the sport. One of the sport's important figures, John McPherson, who was a Newtonmore man, had moved to Inverness to take over his family's sports shop. The business, which supplied a variety of sporting equipment, notably Camans, went from strength to strength, and he was responsible for the ongoing tradition of awarding the Camanachd Cup's winning team captain with a silver-mounted Caman. If you want to know more about John McPherson and the story of his business and his impact on the sport, then do go and have a look at Ambala. There's a whole exhibition there about John McPherson and his influence on the game. It was put together by Jamie, my colleague at Ambala, and Helen Pickles, who is a colleague of mine who works at Highland Folk Museum, specifically looking at Shinty. We'll come now into the 20th century and the impact of the World Wars. Now, the World Wars had a huge, huge impact on the sport in different ways. So cammons were shipped out to the front in both wars. The troops received cammons from communities, from businesses. John Macpherson's shop that I mentioned shipped out cammons to the troops. And the ability to do something which so clearly connected them to home was obviously very, very important in both conflicts. And you can see that in correspondence coming back, that the ability to I don't think you would be able to switch off from it, but the ability to turn away from the conflict and the horror and play something that very much associates you with home was very important. In 1914, Kingussie had won both the Camanachd Cup, which is also known as the Scottish Cup, and the McTavish Cup, before the competition was postponed due to the war. Not long after that Kingussie victory, many of the players from Kingussie, from Newtonmore, from Bewley, from all of the teams left the Highlands for the battlefields, and many of them would not return. Many of them fell at the battles of Festubert, at Lewes, various other battles which were particularly hard-hitting to the Cameron Highlanders regiments and other local regiments that were drawn largely from Highlanders. And the Shinty population across the Highlands was decimated by the conflict. If you have a look, again, I mentioned my colleague Helen Pickles, if you have a look, she's written a blog on the Highland Folk Museum website about this, and it's very interesting with some great images along with it. So in 2014 to 2018, many of us involved in heritage and many of us involved just generally hosted events to mark the centenary of the Great War. And there are a number of talks and events that we were involved in which marked the impact of the conflict on the Shinty communities and marked the lives lost. I've mentioned Bewley, Skye, Newtonmore, Kingussie, so many other communities where those young men didn't come home, and that had a devastating impact, of course, on families, on communities, but also on businesses, on sports, on things like that. I mentioned that in 1914, before they went off to fight, Kingussie had won the Camanachd Cup and the McTavish Cup. The 2014 Camanachd Cup, which 100 years on from that, was again won by Kingussie, and they played that match in the jerseys which bore the names of the players of the 1914 winning team, which was very emotional, I think, for all involved. I wanted to read a long extract to you from a post-World War I, the minutes of the McTavish Cup, McTavish Camanachd Association minutes from post-World War I, that reflects on the resumption of that cup after the conflict. Now, as I say, it's a long extract, but I think it's an important one to share with you. I have the pleasure of submitting the report on the affairs of the association. As in the case of kindred sports and associations, the Great World War put an immediate stop to all activities in our direction, at all events so far as competitions for trophies were concerned. The young wielders of the Caman, we are proud to think, were among the very first to turn to the grimmer game of war. And as in days gone by, when they had played the grand old game of Shinty with all their hearts and souls, and with all the vigour characteristic of their Highland breeding, so too in the sterner game did they put their backs into it, to such purpose that they gained the admiration of the whole world, and gained undying distinction as the best fighters in the best army engaged in that terrible conflict. Members of our association were not behind others in springing to arms. We know the record of our illustrious chief, Lord Lovat, and I hope it may not be considered invidious to single out for special mention one of our members of council, Pat McBain, whose breastful of decorations bear eloquent testimony to his bravery and his fighting qualities. The war interruption then effectively put period to our cup competition, but as lovers of the old game it must have been gratifying to us to think that it did not dampen the ardour of our former players, and that while in training they almost instinctively, as it were, turned to it for recreation, and even when back for their short rests out of the trenches they sought a game behind the lines. It's not surprising, therefore, now that the nightmare has passed, that we find something of a nature of a revival in the love of the game. Were it not that many of our most brilliant players are unhappily no longer with us, we should probably in this season witness a greater interest in Shinty than ever before. As it is, that interest seems to be growing daily, and all the indications so far as this competition is concerned point to it being one of the most interesting in its history. Unhappily, our president and the donor of the McTavish Cup is no longer with us to rejoice that once again the possession of his trophy is the end for which our clubs in the district are striving. As you know, the late Mr. McTavish died in the course of this year. Many, many times did he speak to me of the time when, the war over, his boys would turn out again to the game so near to his heart, but never without expressing his admiration for their prowess on the field of battle, his heartfelt sympathy with those broken in the strife, and his fervent wish that many would be spared. At last he himself has not been spared to see the competition once more underway, and it would ill become us if today we did not in some way pay tribute to his memory. He was one of nature's gentlemen, a Highland gentleman at that, one born with an inborn love of everything good and noble, and one who at all times sought to leave the world better than he found it. He recognised, as we all do, that Shinty is the king of games, and that it is essentially a man's game, and that his dearest wish was that it would flourish. By his trophy competition, he probably did as much as any man, if indeed not more, to perpetuate the gaze and to secure that while games might come and games might go, the game of Camanachd should continue through all things. We cannot but be grateful to him for his interest, and for my part I cannot but feel that the welfare of the association and the conduct of the competition is a solemn charge left in our hands to faithfully carry out as we conceive his wishes would be. It's a very touching entry, I think, about McTavish himself, but particularly about that very visual description of the troops, or the Shinty players, who had been so dedicated to the game, turning their focus to the grimmer game of war. I think it's quite an emotive description. I wanted to share it with you. I mentioned when I talked about that police occurrence book that Shinty can be seen in collections other than those that are Shinty specific. And I wanted to tell you about a couple of examples of that. So for instance, we have magazines from Portree High School that record the school's 1924 triumph in the inaugural Robertson Cup. There are entries in the police detention books in Fort William of people being detained for daring to play Shinty in the street. There are references to Shinty within the Town Council minutes across the Highlands. So for instance, the 1940s Town Council minutes of Fort William talk about the conditions of the pitch and the work that needed to be done to ensure that teams out with Fort William would be happy to come and play. And we saw that last week in the football as well, that if you don't keep the pitches up to good condition, then maybe people won't come and play and you'll lose your standing, and that huge knock-on effect. There are references to Shinty within the personal papers. For instance, this 1935 diary of Donald Gillis, which is held in our Highland Archive Centre. And it reads, 1935, January the 1st, so again that New Year's Day match. A Shinty match was played at Oban between Oban Shinty Club and Glasgow Sky Camanachd for the new trophy called the Cade MacLean Cup. The cup was presented by Mr William Mackintosh as a memorial to his friend Mr Maclean, both at one time well-known Shinty players. After a hard tussle, the cup was won by Oban, who beat the Glasgow Sky by 9-1. So you can see that the importance of the game features in people's social life, in people's entertainment, free time. There's also extracts in school records. This one is from the 1960s, from Portree High School, written by Bertie Mackay. I don't know if you're watching, Bertie, but I saw that you commented on this extract on our Sky Lochash Facebook page the other day. That was quite fun. So written when he was in 3B. Junior Shinty. Shinty was taken very seriously this year, and it was hoped that the team would get on well in the Macpherson Cup. Our first game against our old rivals Plockton was played on a fearful pitch, but resulted in a decisive victory for us. Callum Murkison was one of the many stars, scoring 4 out of our 9 goals. No return game was played as it was thought unnecessary. Practices were held every Wednesday in preparation for our next games against Dingwall at Balmacara, but lack of practice on a grass pitch slowed us down and we were beaten 3-0, a very encouraging result against a superior side. I would like to take this opportunity of thanking Mr Macpherson and Mr Mackenzie for their contribution of sticks, and Mr Maclean and Mr Macdonald for their help in training our team. I love that. I love the maturity. I don't know if that was coming from you yourself or coming from a teacher, going, that is a very encouraging result against a superior side, so take heart. We also hold match programmes, scoring notebooks, and a huge amount of other documents from the 1970s onwards, but I didn't think you would want me to read you the match results from then on. The next big date in the story of Shinty is 1996, which was the establishment of a national league for the first time. Previously, as I've mentioned, there had been local leagues, but really the dominant things were the cups. And as I say, I haven't mentioned all of them. Various teams have won the league, including Fort William and Kinlochshiel, but again, the dominance of Newtonmore and Kingussie is very visible in the league, and you can see that they've often won long streaks at a time. However, the game remains amateur, although there is sponsorship in it as well now, but it's still essentially an amateur game. I wanted to finish briefly by touching on the women's game, and it of course it frustrates me that I can only touch briefly on the women's game, but it took much longer to get off the ground officially. It took, as a founded and established game, it took much longer. There had been games played, of course, but they're not very visible in the historical record because, as several of those extracts that I've read to you show, it was essentially seen as a manly, masculine, violent game to play, a very masculine sport, as seen in the record. So there has always been a women's game, but it's only much more recently become official. So the Women's Camanachd Association was formed in 2001 to develop and promote the women's game. And so now many of the clubs that I have mentioned during this, and many others, have women's teams as well as men's teams and junior teams. And among the things that the women's team compete for is the Valerie Fraser Camanachd Cup, which was last won in 2019 by Skye Camanachd. There's a huge passion for the game that continues, and you can see that. I think it's not just a game, it's entwined, as we saw from that first meeting of Strathglass, it's entwined with the language, with the music, with the culture, with the pipes. There's a huge cultural importance to Shinty in the Highlands. Long rooted in the communities here, and a very strong image of Scotland that's portrayed elsewhere as well. In 2018, in the Skye and Loch Archive Centre, we hosted an event to mark the 125th anniversary of Skye Camanachd, and it was so popular and so well attended by players, by former players, by locals, by tourists, that it had to be extended. So there's a huge love and passion for the game. The other thing I wanted to touch on was that the Shinty community, much like various other sports at this time, have a big movement towards encouraging reminiscence work. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, about how the sport is using the things associated with the history of the sport to encourage reminiscence work and to work with people with dementia, older people, isolated people, to talk about the game and what it's meant to them. As I say, Shinty has done that. Various other sports are also heavily involved in that just now. So if you're interested in finding out about that, do have a look at Shinty Memories. If you just Google Shinty Memories, then you'll find it. Hugh Dan and others involved in that. So if you want to find out more generally about Shinty, please do have a look at the Shinty Memories website at shinty.com, which is the Camanachd Association website. The Women's Camanachd also have a website with information on it. Ambala, which I've mentioned before, has various exhibitions about the history of the sport. And the Highland Folk Museum has online blogs and exhibitions. And also, if you're able to go in person to the Folk Museum, you'll see the Boleskine Shinty Pavilion there, which was moved and donated to the Folk Museum, so you can actually go and have a look at it there as well. Also, the last thing I would say, and I'm seeing Inverness Women's Shinty team coming up there, I am sure I speak on behalf of the teams where I say if you want to find out more about the sport, contact the teams. They will be absolutely delighted to tell you about it and to encourage you along. So please do that. Okay, I'm going to stop talking. I've run over a little bit. Thank you for joining me. I hope that it's been of interest to find out a little bit more about Shinty. The next 2 weeks will be pre-recorded because I am on leave to get married. So we'll be moving into transport as a subject. So next week I'll be doing railways, and the following week boats, ferries and the Meikle ferry disaster. So both of those will be pre-recorded and scheduled. So you'll see premieres that will come up as advertised. So please do have a look for them, mark that you're interested in attending, and join me for that. And in both of those, please do continue to comment, to speak. There will be other staff there who can respond, and I will most certainly pick them all up when I get back from leave. Thank you for joining me. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very, very grateful for that. So I will look forward to seeing you in a few weeks, and you can see me in the next week. Thank you.